Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm Roger Gattell, VP of Sales here at Dundas Data Visualization, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. I want to start by thanking each of you for attending and remind you that the intent of this webinar is to provide a framework for you in help selecting the right KPIs and business metrics for your project success. Dundas BI allows organizations to connect and interact and visualize its data, KPIs, and business metrics with great ease and functionality, ensuring ultimately that what gets measured gets done. Our customers have asked for a way where they can easily share information and analytics across the organization, both with business users and technical users. And also helping them unlock the value of their data so that can be shared not only with the business, but with their customers as well. I wanted to start by introducing our president and CEO at Dundas Data Visualization, Troy Marchand. Troy is an expert in data visualization and business intelligence, and he's been leading Dundas for over 20 years, right from our beginnings in the component space through to Dundas Dashboard and Dundas BI, which we sell in the space today. Welcome, Troy. Just a reminder, everybody, there'll be a chance to ask questions after the demo, and we'll endeavor to get to all of them. Should you have specific needs or would like more detailed information, then we'd be happy to follow up directly. Just send us a quick email to info@dundas.com. Also, there are a number of options for both technical and business users to get a more hands-on feel, which we can discuss later in this call. Right now, I'll turn things over to Troy, our president and CEO, to discuss selecting KPIs for your business success. Thanks so much. Troy?
Thank you, and welcome everyone to today's webinar on selecting KPIs and performance metrics. I'm Troy Marchand, CEO of Dundas Data Visualization. The goal for today's webinar is to provide you with some tools and ideas that will help in your selection and help in verification that your performance metrics are going to be effective. First, let's go through the different areas we're going to cover today. First, the definition of KPIs and their attributes. Second, one of the most important things, which is understanding why. Third, we're going to cover some of the key reasons and provide you some of the tools you need to select the right KPIs, and then we're going to follow that up with a Q&A session. I tend to put business metrics into one of two buckets, performance metrics and result metrics, and you can really think of them as cause and effect. It's really important to distinguish between these two. It may seem like a simple concept, but a lot of the time people are trying to use result metrics to increase performance, and you really don't get the results you're looking for. So we're going to cover this in a little bit more detail throughout the webinar, but this is a very important key concept to remember. So what is a KPI? Experts don't agree on its definition, so this is a problem in itself. This is why you'll notice throughout this webinar I won't be really using that term too often, because I want to really make sure there's a distinguishing difference between performance metrics and result metrics, whether they're key metrics or just other metrics themselves. So instead of using this as a catch-all, which some people do, or even to indicate performance and result metrics, I'm going to separate them out, and for today's purpose I'm really defining KPI as a performance metric that'll help an organization improve the performance of their numbers to hit a key result. So if you're talking to people and you use the term KPI, make sure that you're clear on the definition of how you're using that so people don't interpret it incorrectly and may give you different results than you're looking for. This is a list of some of the more common attributes of an effective performance metric. So this list can be used as a checklist to validate metrics you may already have in mind, or as a roadmap to help you figure out what metrics may improve the performance of a desired result. So we want to make sure there's a strong influence on the desired outcome, such as sales. We want to increase the sales numbers. What is that action that we do ahead of time that really changes the sales? It may be the number of calls. It may be the number of face-to-face meetings. So we've got to go back and try to find that cause and effect relationship. You want to make sure it's actionable, such as making the number of calls, making a certain number of meetings. You want to also make sure that the target audience has control over those actions. So for example, we don't want to use the number of leads sent to a salesperson as a performance metric because they don't have control over the number of leads. What they do have is control over what they do with those leads, such as turnaround time. Maybe turnaround time has a strong correlation to clients moving on to the next phase of a sales process. So we want to try to figure out what influences that desired result. Another really important thing is they're generally not financial amounts. Those are usually result metrics. Very, very seldom a financial amount will actually influence performance. It can in the short term. So for example, by posting up in a sales department what each sales rep is bringing in, it will bring up performance a slight amount because of that competitive nature, but it will not create sustained performance increases. So this is why a lot of people do mix up result metrics and performance metrics, because they'll try it posting something like that up on a board somewhere and saying here's what each rep is doing to try to create that competitive nature, and it will jump up a bit, but you'll notice after a month or two of that it will not make a difference anymore. So that kind of competitiveness kind of disappears. So you don't get sustained performance increases, and because you got them in the short term, then people think that there's something else wrong. It's not the metric itself. The other part to consider is that it should generally occur early in a process. So the earlier that we can find a number that influences an outcome, the better. Because if that number is off, we have time to fix it. The later it happens in the process, the less time we have to fix that particular issue. Another aspect of that as well is if a process is too long, I'm going to use sales again. Let's say a sales cycle is 3 to 4 months long. It's really hard for people to associate an action with a result that has way too much time in between. So what we want is quick wins. This is sort of why certain video games are very addictive. You do something, you get a win right away. So the shorter amount of time between an action and the result, the better that's going to affect behavior. And that's what we want to do at the end of the day. We want to try to help people get excited about winning and getting to that next step in a process. So longer processes should be broken down into sub-processes. So that way you may have what we'd refer to as a key performance metric at the beginning, but we're going to break it down into sub-pieces with their own performance and result metrics to get to that final key result that we're looking for. We don't want too much time in between, and as I said, the longer the amount of time in between, the less effective it is at modifying the behavior that we're looking for to increase performance. Not knowing why is the number one reason why BI, dashboard, and reporting projects fail to deliver. This is a very important piece and is one of the more often overlooked pieces. And it may be because it seems so obvious, but it's not as obvious as you might think at the end of the day. Too often, suggested solutions are given that masquerade as a business need. And too often, unfortunately, technical people will not say, okay, you've got this, but why do you need that? They generally go off and just do what they're told. So really, this is a key to everything else. Without knowing why, you can't validate whether this project will deliver upon the actual business needs or not. So it needs to be communicated to everybody. It's very important to do. So if you start off and you are given a suggested solution or you're delivering a suggested solution, really you need to stop and go, well, why? Why is this the suggested solution? Why? And keep asking why, until you get down to things such as reduced expenses, reduced risk, or increased revenue. So you want to really get to that point. But you also want to know the whys in between. So if it was, I'm going to use sales one more time, we're asked to build a dashboard that shows you the sales for the month. Well, why do you want those? Well, sometimes people just jump right to the end and say, well, I want to increase revenue. But really, you want to try to find out, well, why you're looking for this particular dashboard. How do you think that's going to really help you? So we want to understand the reasoning for each thing underneath. And that may allow us to pick different metrics, or how we actually display those metrics, which is just as important at the end of the day. So we've got to start with this step. If we don't get this step right, everything else that follows will not be as effective as it could be. So as I mentioned before, we need to make sure that there's actions associated with your performance metrics. Without changes in these actions or behaviors, you don't see a change in performance. That's just clear at the end of the day. If people continue to do what they were doing before, you get what you've got before. So picking a performance metric, you also need to make sure that you've really defined what are those actions and processes that go with each one. And not just a single action. So a lot of the time, let's use a call center, for example. So if the hold times are above a certain threshold, what are the changes that are required in order to bring it back down to that threshold? So it does require an action plan or a process that has to be looked at and dealt with. So you need to make sure that for each threshold a performance metric may have, that you also have these actions associated with it. And that's how you can tell whether it's effective or not. So if you have no actions or very few actions associated with a performance metric, you're not going to get a lot of changes. Also, different thresholds. What do they do if they're below a certain number? This is another thing that is often overlooked when people do pick a performance metric, that they don't have thresholds associated with it. Therefore, there's no real expected change in behavior, and therefore you're not going to really see a change in performance. So once you have those actions in place, and a good way to try to figure out what those are in different areas is look at your top performers. What are the actions that they're doing? What are they doing to make things work well? So we want to try to figure out if numbers are at certain levels, do they change their behaviors? And now we want to make sure that we communicate those actions and processes to each person who is measured by that performance metric. So also, again, we want to break lengthy processes down into sub-processes, so it's easier for people to associate that action with the result. As I mentioned before, the shorter the time in between, the better. So we want to create an environment so people can do a lot of quick, short wins, because that gets them going and they want to win at the end of the day. So we want to break it down. We want to make sure that people associate the action with the result, which is key to changing behavior. Even if you are confident that you've selected an effective performance metric, you still may not see the results that you were expecting. Measurement dysfunction is something that does occur fairly often with good performance metrics, and you may think the metric itself is not overly effective. However, it may be how the metric is being used or implemented. So for example, if a metric is only being used as a punishment, again, number of calls a person may do, if they go below a certain number, it's just an opportunity for a manager to yell at them. But if they do better, there's no upside for an employee. So this can lead to people just doing the minimum. They're just getting just enough to make sure that they don't get yelled at. It does not create an environment where people want to do more. They just want to do the minimum. Ranking, another really common way that people use a lot of metrics. Very common in sales. Who sold the most? So what you're doing is you're creating an opportunity for one winner and a bunch of losers if you just use ranking. Now, ranking can still be used if you're using it in a very friendly manner, but if you want it to be effective, you want people to achieve more, create something more like a winner's circle. Have something where it's not just a first and everyone else is second, third, fourth, fifth. Because what happens in those situations, it's usually the top few people that are at the top every month, and everyone else always feels like a loser, so they don't try more. But if you create something where everyone can actually beat that threshold, everyone can get there, then within that threshold, ranking is still fun because everyone is still a winner at the end of the day. So that doesn't mean lower expectations for people. It just means create it in such a way that everyone can actually hit or exceed those expectations. Another really common area that is overlooked is quality. So a lot of the time people are measuring quantity. So again, in sales, for example, the number of calls that a person is making is a quantity. So if there's a metric set up saying, hey, each person has to do 50 calls a day because we know X number of calls turns into X amount of sales, so we want to make sure people are hitting that number. But if you're not looking at the quality, what can happen is people hit that quantity number at the cost of quality. So people, just to avoid not being looked at as not doing their job, may do the calls, but they may not have a very good conversion rate. So make sure when we're measuring a performance metric that we're also looking at the quality aspect of it, not just quantity. So quality can be in sales, for example, the number of calls that led to another step in the sales process. In manufacturing, it can be the rate of the units that they made and the rate of failures that they had. So you don't want to just look at the quantity by itself. You want to take a look at it as quantity and quality, because otherwise you will get your quality, but generally will come at the cost of quality. So be careful what you ask for. You might get it. So you've got to make sure that you've got the proper context around how that measurement should happen. So you want to make sure that you're setting up an environment to create winning, and you want to make sure you're not winning at a cost of quality at the end of the day. So making the most effective performance metrics, or selecting the most effective performance metrics right out of the gate, is very difficult to do. So what we want to try to do is approach it from a 360-degree approach, where we make some certain assumptions, sort of like a scientific hypothesis. We're going to go in, we're going to say, I think these are going to be the most effective, so let's implement these. So as part of that, you want to implement an action plan or a process that you then communicate to the team that's being measured. You record and monitor that process, make sure they get the feedback. That's where the dashboards and reports come into play. But then after a period of time, we want to analyze the results. Did we get the results that we were expecting? Are we matching up to what our hypothesis was? A lot of the time it doesn't match exactly, so you've got to go in, you've got to see, was there some measurement dysfunction? Are the cause and effect as closely related as we thought they were? So are we getting the cause and effect that we assumed that we would get? So we've got to take a look, analyze those results, make some refinements to the metrics, possibly to some of the thresholds of the metrics, update our action plans to change some of that behavior, and run the process again. So even if it is working, let's say you refine it enough that it's working really well, don't stop analyzing. Markets change, and with changing markets, we get changing results. So we've got to make sure that they're still effective, because what might be an effective performance metric in one year may not be effective the next. Now, because they change slowly, you may not notice it right away, but you've got to stay on top of this. This is why you need to make sure that your implementation of this does not just include only a portion. You need to look at it from a holistic point of view. So when you design your implementation, you need to make sure you have the right products in place, such as Dundas BI, where we cover all the areas of dashboards, reports, as well as the analytics, so we can do the 360 degree. You don't want just a piece of this project where you only do data analysis, or you only do dashboards, and only do reports. You want to make sure you cover all of these areas, because it is important to make sure that you are looking at it constantly, and you do this loop and constantly refine. It may not be major refinements each time, but you're doing minor tweaks to get those extra amounts of efficiency. There are a few pitfalls that people fall into fairly easily when picking performance metrics. So I'm going to go over some of the more common ones so it's easier to spot when we're going down that path. So the first is using results to measure because they're easier than performance indicators. And this happens a lot because it's just very straightforward to measure results, such as total sales at the end of the day. It's really easy to verify, really easy to see, and they're generally measured. So people tend to go towards the things that are nice and easy there, but they're not necessarily going to increase performance. This kind of goes to the second point, where using what's readily available. Again, results are generally always recorded, such as sales results, such as page views in marketing. Other things like that are generally recorded because a lot of the time, many results are financial in nature, so finance always needs them, so they're generally available. But at the end of the day, each department is measured on the results, so those things are recorded usually in the database, but the actions to get there are generally not recorded, so we're using what's readily available. Now that's not so bad if you're just starting out and you need something to use what you have available, but don't stop there. Don't just use what's in the company's database. Again, going back to the prior points, some people confuse the result indicators with performance indicators. Try to remember, results are the effect or the outcome of performance. So again, even though results will give you a slight performance increase, they won't create a sustained performance increase. Another area that leads back to measuring what's easy are a lot of small things. Instead of the right things that cause a substantial performance increase, we tend to measure sometimes things that don't make much of a difference but are much easier to measure. And the last thing is the "you can't measure what I do" fallacy. This happens a lot because, again, some things to measure the performance are harder than measuring the results. It seems a little bit more intangible in some of these things, but everything can be measured. We just have to stop and figure out what is the aspect of that action that we can actually measure. So there are some great techniques there. Unfortunately, we won't have enough time to go through that today because that's basically an entire webinar in its own right. So again, I just wanted to give you some high-level things so you could really look at, what are the things that you really need to be doing when selecting, what are the things that you want to try to avoid, so you have a general set of guidelines to try to help you get in the right direction. So to sum everything up, first, we need to clearly define and communicate the business need, the entire need, to everyone on the team that is working on this project. Don't just assume that they will know what the underlying needs are. Second, ensure that the performance metrics can be acted upon by the target audience. They have control over what those numbers can be. Third, make sure there's appropriate actions for those performance metrics. Make sure that there's different actions for different thresholds, above or below thresholds. What are the actions that you're expecting? And making sure that those are well documented and communicated to the teams that will be acting upon those performance metrics. Then make sure there is a quality aspect when you're looking at a number. If you don't look at this, quality can be the cost of quantity. So you want to make sure you're measuring that in such a way that quality doesn't suffer. So that's usually around putting constraints around those numbers. And lastly, we want to make sure that we're using a 360-degree approach. So when we make certain assumptions, we're communicating those, we're measuring those, we're analyzing those to make sure our assumptions are correct, and then we're tweaking where necessary. And we keep repeating that because even if it's working, it may stop working at some point as the market changes. So you need to make sure that we're doing all of those things in order to ensure that our performance metrics are working as well as possible. And this concludes the presentation portion of the webinar, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we start the Q&A, I wanted to remind you that we have a variety of options available for people to get a more hands-on experience. For the business users, they have a choice: a live demo walkthrough with one of our solution architects or speaking directly with one of our sales reps. And for the more technical users, we can offer a 45-day trial of our software or a full-featured product download. All these options can be discussed with one of our representatives. We'll now open the call for any questions that you may have. Let's go to our first question.
First question I have is, how do I check the quality of an activity in a timely manner if you don't get feedback on the quality from a client until after delivery? So I'm assuming this is for a delivery of a service, maybe it's a product of some sort. So what I would suggest is have milestones throughout the process before the final delivery is given. If you can't do that, and if there's certain situations where the client only sees it after it is delivered, then I'd suggest doing checks. Create your own milestones. Even if it's not a client, have an internal person or someone else look at the work if it requires something like that. Or break the process into several pieces so you have certain milestones that meet certain criteria. Another option in this case too is doing audits. If you can't have someone look at the work in different milestones, then maybe do audits across certain percentages of the work that's being done. Next question I have is, how often should a manager give a report on performance metrics to a worker? Well, I think workers should have the performance metrics in front of them at all times. So if they're being measured on something, they need to know what it is. But the bigger part is focus. It's the out of sight, out of mind problem. If you don't see it every day, it doesn't become as important to you. So you've got to keep it up there. In many cases, you may even want to have wall-mounted dashboards. You have a big monitor with a dashboard with the performance metrics on there. We do that at our offices to keep people focused on the numbers that are important. Really, focus is a big thing, so you've got to have it in front of people. They've got to remember it, so it's got to be front and center all the time. Another question I have is, where do you start if you don't have any historical data to look at? So I'm assuming this may be a new activity or a new area that people are creating. So you might want to start with the process that you have. If someone's already defined, here's the process they think is going to work best, build your performance metrics based off that process. So it's a good starting point that you can then use as you're building your historical data to see, are the cause and effect as related as you think they are, and then start tweaking. But at least you need a starting point. A lot of processes really need just to pick a start, work with it, get some historical data, and continually refine. In many cases, you don't have enough data in a process that's just being created or a new role that's being created. So you do have to start somewhere. And don't wait, that's the bigger things. Don't wait till you have the historical data to build something. Start with something. It may not be perfect, but at least you're pointing the people in the right direction. And if you see it's not working, you can quickly change. So do remember, it is an iterative process that you go through to really refine your performance metrics. Another question I have is, how many performance metrics are needed to monitor and improve performance? Well, really your goal should be to try to get as few as you can. So somewhere in the area of 1 to 3 is really what you want to measure people on. You don't want to get into 5, 6, 7, 8. The more you have, the less people focus. It's hard for them to know really what's important if you have too many things going on, so they'll get spread too thin, or they'll focus on ones that are easier to achieve versus the ones that are more important to yourself. So really you want the least you can get, but you want to be able to break them up again. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, if there's too much time in between an action and a result, you may want to break it up. But you don't want to break it into such small parts that it becomes almost impossible for people to figure out what's important, what's not important. So keep them low, try to get as few as you can, but at the same time, you don't want too much time in between. So it is a bit of a balancing act, but where you can, you want people to focus. More is not better. In this case, less is better. Another question is, how do you change performance culture using KPIs? So I'm assuming this is around changing the behavior and getting people to be bought into using these metrics to change their performance and behavior. So step one is really communication. You need to make sure it's well communicated to everyone involved, making sure that people know what they are, why you're doing it. So a really good communication plan is the first step. The second part is focus and discipline. The idea is you want to make sure people are focusing on these numbers, and managers cause a lot of issues where one day they're focusing on the numbers, next day they're focusing on something else. So it sends a very mixed message. So one of the big things is being consistent and having that discipline to not go off target, where one day we're talking about performance and metric, next day we're talking about another area. Last thing to really help make this change is making sure that the metrics that are picked are really helping the employees, not set up for punitive purposes. Again, sometimes managers can look at these numbers and just the only time that they talk about them is when things go wrong. So the performance metrics become just a negative experience for employees, not something that they want to look at and improve upon. It's something that they look at to do just the minimum so they don't get in trouble. So we don't want to turn it into where that is the focus is, let's do the least amount I need to do so no one is going to come along and tell me I'm doing a bad job. So we want to get people excited about doing these things. So there's got to be an upside to this. There's got to be a positive aspect to these numbers to get people really bought into really changing how they look and use these numbers. Another question is, what comes first, a process or performance metric? Well, both are really tied together very strongly. So you can start almost any way, but really what you want to do is you want to start with the expected results. What are the results that you're looking for? And let's work backwards from that. So if you have historical data, let's try to figure out what common actions or events led to the types of results you're looking for. So if you don't have a lot of historical data, and maybe you just have a process that is being put in place, I'd start with the process. Let's look into the process. Let's try to figure out what we think are going to be the most powerful effects on the result that we are trying to achieve, and start recording the data from there. So it's really a very iterative process that we need to go through a lot of the time. So many companies don't have a lot of the data that they really need to figure this out. So you've got to start somewhere, start with the process, or if you think there's a metric that it will work, then modify your process if it's not already in line with that metric to meet that. So they have to be hand in hand, but you can start from one side or another if you really don't have a lot of information to go on. But if you start, doesn't matter, but you need to. So if you start, it doesn't matter which side you really go from, but you need to start recording and analyzing and refining. Until you get through a round or two, you may not know if they're overly effective or if there's side effects, if there's some dysfunction of the measurements you do have. So this is why you've got to measure it. But picking a starting point can start from pretty much anywhere. You've got to take the knowledge that you have and start at some point. That's really what it kind of comes down to. So if you have historical data, if you have a process, if you have metrics that you think are going to work, you've got to start at some point. But I would say really look at the results first. How do you think you're going to achieve those in the best possible way? And you may come up with different ways of changing your process. You may think of different things. So you almost want to even take maybe a brainstorming approach. Here's the result we want. What are different ways that we can achieve that? It might change completely how you approach a problem, because a lot of time people approach the problem of here's our process and now we've got to try to make results based on this process. Well, sometimes they don't match up, so you've got to always, at the end of the day, you're trying to achieve a certain result. So never forget about that. That's probably the most important part of that process. We're running out of time for more questions. There are several that are still here. What we're going to do is I'm going to make sure I get back to those questions. We'll answer them by email. If you have more questions that you haven't sent in yet, please do so. We will be answering them. One email address that we will be using to take questions will be info@dundas.com. And thank you very much again for joining us today.